Can't Wisconsin? And that's your first question, Dan, can it? And the second piece, which I strongly recommend, I can't read my own handwriting. Can any of my graduate students relate to that? Will Wisconsin Republicans, what's the full title?
Well, actually, the print title was called The Takeover.
Oh, The Takeover, that's right. Okay, and it's a terrific piece on Wisconsin politics. Dan Schaefer next is the, are you the publisher of the Recombobulation Era, the author? Publisher, writer,
Guy writes.
stapler of the newsletter? No, no newsletters anymore. But Dan is also one of the most astute, in my opinion, observers of Wisconsin politics. I strongly suggest that you check out his Recombobulation Area. He did, was it 15 takes on the election? Was that the title? That was a fabulous, just a truly fabulous summary of the state of the election, and I recommend it to everyone who wants to get a good overview of that. And finally, but not least, Toya Washington, who, God, have you been there since 2002? Is that
20 years in
WISN? God, we're both getting old.
I started when I was 12. So.
Yeah. Toya Washington is an anchor of the award-winning WISN Channel 12 news team. Co-anchor the 5 p.m. newscast right now. Has co-anchored the top-rated 6 p.m. cast. She's reported on presidential campaigns. She's been observing Wisconsin and national politics for, well, 20 years at least. And not last but not least is a graduate of our program, and we're extraordinarily proud of her. Also a longtime member of the Board of Visitors. So thank you all for being here. So now let's get to it. I guess, first of all, I want to acknowledge, of course, that that we're here, for a purpose, and to honor the legacy of Bill Krause, who himself was one of the most, maybe among the most astute observers of Wisconsin politics that our state has ever seen. So I want to actually start with a quick quote from Bill, and I want to open up our conversation from there. He said, it's in the Cap Times op-ed page, but 2011, anyone who has seen the process up close wants nothing more to do with drawing the lines for legislative districts. All turf battles bring out the worst in our political system, and redistricting is a virtual golf course, and that's only half of it. When the opportunity to get a 10-year advantage rears its ugly head, really bad things happen. Now that was 2011. So I'd like us to look back on the 10-year history, 10-plus year history of gerrymandering in Wisconsin. And I think one of the biggest questions in both in Wisconsin politics and in covering Wisconsin politics is, and I can't but put it bluntly and simply, will this gerrymander likely ever be undone? And if it isn't, what do you see the implications? If it is, how? Please tell me. If it is, how might it be undone? And if it isn't, at least not in the near future, what are the implications of this continuing gerrymandering for civil life in Wisconsin? Anybody want to pick that up?
Sure. I will get it started, I guess, by saying it's really hard to envision how it happens. There's obviously been a number of legal challenges, and the courts have not had the answer. I think one thing about Wisconsin that is somewhat unique is that we don't, like other states, have a direct ballot initiative option. So, when you look at some other states that have been able to change the redistricting process, or are in the attempts to do that, we know that it's a very popular thing. We know that it's something that voters want pretty overwhelmingly, but voters don't have a mechanism by which to accomplish that. So, yeah, when you're in power, you don't want to give up that power. That's not a partisan thing. So it's really hard to envision how that changes without something dramatic changing at the systemic level, whether that's another lawsuit or some change in the way that legislation is actually crafted.
Yeah, I think there is actually a potential path to addressing the redistricting in Wisconsin in the fairly immediate future. We have an election for state Supreme Court coming up next spring. And that could go a long way to opening up potential challenges to those maps. Of course, the courts are unpredictable, so you don't know if that path will directly lead to changing those maps that are so tilted to one side in Wisconsin. But as far as what the best chance is to reevaluating the process, reevaluating the maps, reevaluating the structural fundamentals of state government in Wisconsin, I think the chance that liberals have to regain the balance of the court in April is the best chance that we have to, realigning that paradigm within the state legislature.
I'll just say, I think it was a hugely consequential thing. Along with Act 10, it was kind of the harbinger of what was to come, and sort of the beginning of the real undermining of the state's democratic lowercase d traditions that had been, widely accepted in a bipartisan way for decades and generations, going back to Warren Knowles, expanding collective bargaining rights, to Pat Lucey, making it easier to vote. These kinds of things, when I grew up in Wisconsin in the 70s and 80s, were widely accepted. The idea that you would encourage civic participation was a civic tradition here, and it was a really strong one, and citizens were encouraged to go into government. But the 2011 gerrymandering, I think, opened up this, it had a lot of national implications too, because I think it revealed this power at all costs mentality. And you look at the, even though I agree with Dan that the Supreme Court race is very important, but then a lot of this stuff has been nationalized. There's a US Supreme Court decision that will come next year around what had been a fringe constitutional theory called the independent state legislature theory, which would basically give control, all control over elections essentially, to state legislatures. And in the case of Wisconsin, that essentially means, the Republican Party. So I think it was a very terrifying kind of presaging of what was to come, and cleared the way for virtually everything that happened afterward and is continuing to happen.
All right, let me begin by saying I have strep throat, so I'm trying to stay as far away as possible, so that's why I'm also holding the mic with my sleeve. When we do breakouts, I will be respectful and put on a mask, but I promise I will not kiss any of you today. I'm glad we all got the black and gray memo, so that's good. And I feel highly unqualified to be sitting at this table because there's a brilliant insight there. And just from my perspective and from where I come from, I think that, and I live in Lake Country in Waukesha County, and really have observed over the years, separate from my role as someone who's on air, the underswell and the growing amount of people who are fully understanding the what will come if there is no movement on this. And I really think our job, my job as a journalist, is also to fully explain the implications of what's going on. And you're right, people who are in power do not want to give up power, correct? But I will say, unfortunately, the tone and tenor of on-camera journalism is really hard to deliver that type of message to people, what's at stake, because quite frankly, it's boring TV, and it's hard to sell. But what I have, what has given me glimmers of hope as far as balancing that scale is seeing a real community effort to educate one another. So those who live within the WOW counties, as we call them, Washington, Ozaukee, Waukesha, those really trying to educate each other. So from, a mom, wife, community member, I think that there is a path, and I think that it has to be more organic in the sense that sharing that information rather than someone who's sitting on TV espousing it.
That opens up actually a whole set of interesting questions, your first answers. But so first of all, arguably, as Dan said, I won't say, no, Dan Kaufman, Wisconsin has been a harbinger in many ways. What happened here since 2011 really, at many stages along the way, presaged the rise of our national politics, and starting in 2016. So we could see the kind of division, we could see the excoriation of the other side emerging here very, very early on. Quick point from Mike's presentation of data this morning. Mike and Devon, by the way, don't ever let me near the numbers. That's one of our rules. I think it was even among Republicans, there was 60% reports, just north of 60% support for a bipartisan, or nonpartisan, I should say, redistricting commission. So I want to just point out the dilemma here. And this reinforces what you just said, Toya, even Republicans who benefit, and I say even only because there's partisan benefit from the gerrymander, recognize that this is not good for civil society. I think that's a hopeful sign, but of course, what are the mechanisms, if any, but the Supreme Court for actually undoing that? And yeah.
Yeah, I think, one of the things within that, talking about the redistricting process that came into focus over these last 2 years, we had, I think it was October 2021 when Robin Voss and Devin LeMahieu introduced their maps, and there was a long public hearing at the Capitol that day. And there were many people, like you said, of all political persuasions, showing up that day, voicing their support for nonpartisan redistricting, being opposed to these maps. And there was about a 9-hour public hearing, and the number of people who spoke in support of the maps that the Republicans were introducing was 0. So there was no political support, visible political support, nobody willing to stand up and say these are good and fair maps. But because Republicans hold so many of the levers of power in Wisconsin, those are the maps that we end up with. And those maps are even more gerrymandered than the maps that were considered the nation's most gerrymandered state legislative maps for the past decade.
If I could just add one thing to what Dan said, it's also, going back to 2011, one of the things that was really noticeable about it, it was done in secret at this law office across the street from the state capitol, and all the legislators that signed onto it were given non-disclosure agreements, and they had to sign them. And I think that really told a larger story about one of the things that, again, one of these bipartisan or nonpartisan traditions of Wisconsin civic life was openness, open government, and there was no input from any member of the public when this happened. And I think that the method of it did reveal a lot about what was to come beyond just the gerrymandering, but it was like, essentially a power grab, and it was successful because they had the votes, and there was no compunction about doing it. I mean, they saw their chance and they went for the most extreme version. They were given several various maps, and they decided on the most extreme version of, to maintain control. And in fact, there's a funny anecdote that a guy named Fred Kessler, a wonderful state rep, told me. He said, he got on the floor and he said, I predict with these maps, the Democrats will never get more than 40 seats. And then in some emails that were revealed later through an open records request, one of the mapping experts told one of the Republican aides, Kessler's wrong, they'll only get 39. So they really did have it down to a science. And that's, in fact, the guy was right. They never got more than 39 seats. So.
I want to come back to a point that Toya made a few minutes ago. But first I want to ask Jesse a question that's related to it, which is, you're the most day in, day out direct observer of our legislature on this panel. We laugh because we love. How does the legislature, or maybe I should reframe that, can the legislature function under these conditions? I mean, essentially, has the legislative process effectively come to halt as a bipartisan process in the state of Wisconsin?
I think there are layers to that. You know, anytime you ask people who are in a position to sign bills, whether it was Scott Walker or Tony Evers as governor, they'll point out to you that a large percentage of the bills that they do end up signing are bipartisan. The thing is, most of those bills are bills that you're not paying attention to. They're small tweaks to things that maybe a local government needs. They're not the things that make the headlines or make the good TV that are controversial and spark big fights and we're all talking about. So can it function? Sure. Can it function well? No, not really. There's no incentive for compromise or you know, for cooperation, really. I think we have yet to see how that's going to play out now. I mean, over the last 4 years, certainly the objective for Republicans in the legislature was to keep Tony Evers from getting a win, to keep him from getting reelected. Now that he's been reelected and you know, I would guess probably is not thinking about necessarily running for a third term, is this a situation where there is a little bit more of an incentive to compromise because people have asked for this, you know, divided government, they've asked for this, this scenario, but they're also frustrated that things haven't gotten done over the last 4 years. We're seeing ideas of that floated. Are they going to come to fruition is a different question. You know, covering legislative sessions over the last 10-ish years, there'll be kind of times where it seems like people are starting to get along a little bit more again, and they're, you know, getting together outside of the Capitol, and then, okay, you have Act 10, and then you recover from that, and then you have the lame duck session, and then, you know, no one has faith in each other anymore, no one trusts in each other anymore. And so I think we're still in one of those periods of distrust where there's not a lot of faith in reaching across the aisle on either side. Maybe that will change, but certainly the larger majority you have, you don't have to, you know, you don't necessarily have to get those votes unless you do want the bill signed into law, and it's not just a messaging thing, it's an actual policy thing. So it's not functioning well, but it's not completely, like, it hasn't completely gone off the rails.
So I want to use that to come back to something Toya said a few minutes ago. I was in television, I was a television news executive producer, so I can talk about TV. Television obviously is not the medium that's most likely to dig in the weeds of legislating, or even particularly to cover even the broader issues. But it is the medium, and our research shows this, that most people follow. Most people get most of their news, and certainly anything about the state, from local television. And so this is initially for Toya, but for anyone else. We have this sort of paradox, perhaps, where the medium that people most rely on is the one, for a variety of reasons. It's not because bad people are making bad decisions, but you have a mass audience. You're not going to be spending a lot of time on your local legislative delegation, for example, who most people likely don't even know who those folks are, right? So is there any way, and this is for you initially and then anyone else, to begin, given the media ecology that we live in, not the ideal one, to begin to break through people's relative public opinion disconnection, accepting in the most aggregate terms of I love, I hate, you know, the legislature, to break through and actually get people to think about these things, pay attention to them again?
That's a very good question. I'm so used to asking the questions that it's very hard to be answering questions. I would say that there is a way, there is a vehicle, and right now, and I'm not just saying this because it's on our air and because I love this man so much, but Matt Smith, who hosts Up Front, can do a brilliant job in telling those stories. And why I say that these
Could you
topics...
just tell people what Upfront is?
I'm sorry. Upfront is a political news and discussion show that airs
Sunday morning, right?
Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock. Okay. And then I think it re-airs maybe like at 11. Set your DVR, that's the easiest way to do it. Because I'm sure all of you guys are at church or, you know. But I would say he does a masterful job at breaking those down. I think when I say that it doesn't make good TV because people like active visuals, right? people sometimes tend to tune out, no offense to you, when it comes to maps and graphs and charts and things of that nature. So presenting it in a format for TV, people's attention span can be a minute 30. So that's kind of where when we put together.
It's a long piece.
Yeah, no, some days that is a long piece. The days of doing like a 3-part series when there are 3 minutes in an A block of a newscast on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we just don't have the attention span. This is a big reason why. But I think telling those stories, Matt Smith does a brilliant job of doing it. I think those of us who are on-air or TV journalists need to find more creative ways to make those graphs, maps, charts sexy, and people will then pay closer attention. But I would highly recommend, and I think he did not too long ago, part of a half an hour on gerrymandering and on redistricting. That was, I mean, like I said, he does a brilliant job at it. Yeah, that's not my wheelhouse, and it's obvious when I watch the way he presents that type of coverage.
I second that. He's fantastic at it.
He is.
So what, thinking about, solutions, not that there's any solution per se, but what would, Dan, obviously Dan Schaefer, in your way, you are in a very, in a more direct, social media directed way, trying to tackle these issues. Are you finding that you're connecting with audiences that move outside the circle of folks who are hyper interested in these things?
Yeah, so what I do is a little bit unconventional, at least compared to some of the traditional TV and print media folks that we have up here. But I have I've been writing this weekly column for about 3 years now. I get a ton of attention on stuff that is about redistricting and about those different things. One of the exercises that I went through in 2020, and again this year, was I previewed every race on the map in the Wisconsin State Legislature. So the Recombobulation Area is the only publication crazy enough to write about all 116 races on the ballot across the state. And in going through that process, you really get an understanding of how important these maps are, how they are the skeleton key for the Republicans to retain power even as they lose statewide elections, and how it really stifles the type of civic debate that we're celebrating here at this conference. As I went through previewing that series in the State Assembly, there were, of the 99 races, there were really only about 10 that were truly competitive. So the Republicans had drawn the maps so that there were at least 35 safe Republican seats, about 20 safe Democratic seats. Most of them had strong favorites, but there was really only kind of 5 to 10 in the middle that had competition for voters, and really trying to move to the center and find those common grounds and win over those independent voters that matter so much in Wisconsin elections. So I think the way that has resulted in a lot of ways, in the way that state government operates, has been really difficult as well. And I think one statistic that I often point to with this from the most recent legislative session is that of the bills introduced by Democrats, obviously Republicans hold the majority, but of the bills introduced by Democrats, less than 2% of them even got a public hearing, which I think is just runs counter to the way that state government and politics in general should work.
And you've written about that specifically, and I'm guessing that even I, who follows your blog, I didn't know that. So I mean, it speaks to the sort of information deficits that people have about the state legislature. Dan, sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm lucky to write for a magazine where you do get a bit more space, and one thing that you can do that's really interesting, and in terms of covering Wisconsin, kind of feeds into the history that I'm very fascinated with. The state has always been encouraged kind of active citizenship, going back to Bob La Follette. And so for me, I found some incredible, really enjoyed following these sort of citizen-driven activists, I guess you'd call them. People like Lori Compass, who challenged Scott Fitzgerald in 2011. She was just a wedding photographer. And I think there's some unbelievable kind of David and Goliath narratives that can work very well in a magazine article that can illuminate a much wider issue in a way that is a compelling story, or at least, and I think that's a way that I think is maybe underappreciated, that people can understand politics. A lot of the coverage that I see in the places I write for is always from the top, either horse race or just candidate profiles, and I've always tried to focus as much as I could, as much as my editors would let me, on the sort of from the bottom up, the street level view of what is happening. And what was interesting about Wisconsin is like how the ordinary citizen was so informed, I think, to an unusual degree. You saw that during the protests over Act 10. I mean, that was the largest labor uprising in decades. And people were reading, they were staying late into the night, testifying, all kinds of people that weren't necessarily even in the unions. And I think there's that tradition made for very good journalistic opportunities for me, especially in terms of longer magazine-style piece.
So I want to just pop back to Dan on that question. Can you just tell us a little bit about Luann Byrd and how you discovered that race and how that race perhaps made connections? And
Yeah, so as part of my coverage of the midterm elections, as I mentioned, I was writing a whole lot about the state legislature and the redistricting that was happening. And one of the kind of places where the redistricting had the greatest impact was in the Milwaukee suburbs. That is, Milwaukee County suburbs, some of the inner ring Waukesha County, Ozaukee County suburbs had been shifting towards Democrats in recent election cycles. Well, the Republicans saw that happening and they moved the goalposts, right? In many of those districts, they made it either very safe re-election fights for Democrats or very safe re-election fights for Republicans. There was really one exception to that in the Milwaukee area, and that is in the 84th district in the southwest suburbs of Milwaukee, Greenfield, Greendale, Hales Corners. And the Democrat who was running in that race was a woman by the name of Luann Byrd. And I came across her campaign, as I was finding this. She was running against a very well-known Milwaukee figure, Bob Donovan, who had run high-profile races for mayor in Milwaukee. He had been a well-known name for 20 years, and she's running this upstart campaign against him, and it really kind of lined up because it was the only race in the Milwaukee area that was really competitive. The only anything close to a 50-50 race. And she ended up running this very unconventional campaign that I found so interesting. We all have just experienced this midterm election cycle, and it is probably a big understatement to say that it was relentlessly negative, right? But Luann Byrd did not want to go into that type of negative campaigning that had dominated our politics. Her campaign theme was choose civility. She did all these events with local musicians. She talked about hope. She was very authentic. She talked about wanting to change a broken system. The quote that really stood out from her when I interviewed her is that she said, "I'm not running to beat something, I'm running to change something." So I think that campaign for me really resonated at a time where we had so many negative messages. And she was in this unique district trying to break through with an unconventional campaign message, which I thought was just a really fascinating. So if you want to check it out, the piece is called Bird on a Wire at the Recombobulation area. She did not win, unfortunately. She outran the numbers, the math for her district. She knocked 1 million doors, but she lost by 2%.
That sort of brings us back to the question of political geography, and I just want to note that political geography and media ecology are very interlinked. That's one of the things that we study, or I can still say we, right? That we study in our research group. One of the hardest questions, again, is how do you get folks in Milwaukee to understand, for example, that they're actually being underrepresented by certain maps? How do you get folks in Tosa, where there's actually, other than I'm sorry, not Tosa, in Greenfield, where there's no media coverage, right, of that race. Even in the I mean, possibly episodic in the Journal Sentinel, the paper of record in Milwaukee. So my point here is that there are gaps in the media ecology between the high level and excellent coverage that people on this panel do and the last mile, as it were, which is really television for most people, or newspapers to some extent. So how do we begin to plug those gaps, I think is a major challenge. One of the things that's emerging in the state, and I'm sorry, one of our panelists this morning, it was Danny talked about how the Daily Show was one of the most popular shows among African Americans. In this state, comedy is a means for education. So we have an interesting experiment going on. A new radio network called Civic Media, which apropos to our conversation today, 6, soon to be 8 stations statewide. Kristen Breyer, former comedian, but also a super smart, educated woman, is the anchor of that network. Dan, just disclosure, subs for Kristen. Further disclosure, I advise the network. But it's a different approach to educating people about statewide affairs. Charlie Barron's, the Manitowoc Minute guy, for those of you who don't know his name, also a graduate of the SJMC, School of Journalism, has been doing a series of educative but hilarious videos on gerrymandering, for example. It may be that those are the forms that we need to begin to break through to people. And what does that say about the traditional media ecology that we all represent here? And this is not a gotcha question. It really is a what could be done to increase the salience that those younger folks are starting to find with a different medium and a different kind of audience. Yeah.
I'll keep this brief. I think that became evident by the number of youth, and I say youth, I'm sorry, very carefully, because I am only 32. The number of 18 to 24-year-olds that showed up at the polls this last go-round, I think, is directly linked to consuming that type of product. I don't know from a traditional TV news sense when or how to marry those things or what any of you do, but it is something that is spoken within, I call them the worker bees, in our newsroom about partnering in those ways, because they have the ability to tell a much longer format to get down to those granular levels that we can't, because you have to keep them for, in a 30-minute newscast for that minute 15, minute 30 piece. But pushing to, hey, we have a link on WISN.com from the recombobulation area that goes into a much deeper, trying to change the minds of those the corners, as I call them, that run the worker bees, sometimes is it's frustrating. It really is, because I think they see it, but making the leap to do it is a different thing.
Yeah.
Does that?
It does make sense, and I think that's part of the structural problem of newsrooms, right? The goals of newsrooms, the goals of newsrooms as organizations, as organizations which are there to make money, are not always the same. And to add to that,
when you talk about when we look at numbers and do research, and you see who the viewers are, the viewers that most TV news stations want to capture are those who are spending money with our advertisers. So it's hard to make that mental switch for those people to be like, okay, but the people who are 18 and 24 years old will eventually be that target market that is spending money with the advertisers that we're trying to retain that buy advertising during our newscasts. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Does that? Clear as mud?
no, not at all. It's very clear. I want to use this as a segue to a slightly different topic. Bill Krause also, this was a column from, I believe, 2017, with the fabulous title of "Knowledge Factories Beat Oil and Coal Fields." Essentially, essentially what Bill, first of all, you should know that Bill was instrumental in crafting the UW system as a whole, of integrating what were once fairly independent, or not independent, but teachers' colleges into part of a systematic UW state system. And that's part of my question, which I'll get to in a second. But I want to say that, Bill did say that over the years, several governors and legislatures built and connected to UW-Madison what was once a teachers' college system into university status, which attracts students, the essential raw material for our export system from near and far. So this is my question. The UWs, the non-research UWs are Madison and Milwaukee. The other UWs, Parkside, Whitewater, Green Bay, Oshkosh, of which Dan, I believe, is an alum, right? Are knowledge factories, and they're distributed throughout the state, right? They are in the Bow counties, and they are in the wet Platteville's in the 3rd District and so on. Is there any possibility, given the role of young people in breaking through, given the role of, among other things, comedy and breaking through and new forms of social, to actually be looking at the distribution of those UWs as a kind of anchor for a change in our politics? Does that possibly lay out a kind of framework within which politics, not just in Madison through its growth or the shift in the WOW counties, but also in the other parts of the state where people live and which elect most of our legislators? Is there any possibility for change via those universities, reaching the young people at those universities?
Well, I guess as a graduate a proud graduate of UW Oshkosh, I can answer that one. I think in one of the morning presentations from, I think, Danielle, I'm bad with names, but she was talking about how people are more reliant, are more trusting of individuals over institutions in media. And I think that is, for me as an independent journalist who has found most of his audience through Twitter, a little worried about that right now. But I have been able to see that, I had been a digital editor at Milwaukee Magazine or a reporter at the Milwaukee Business Journal. But being an independent journalist, I feel like, I've had people reach out and say to me that they'll have a different kind of connection to the work that I do, and a different, more, it's more, I've focused on, holding events and building community, and just, I have people tweet at me a picture of the recombobulation area at the Milwaukee airport after they go through security. So I think, the emphasizing the individuals doing the work over the institutions supporting the work, I think is really crucial, especially as, as newspapers continue to cut back and consolidate and all of that. So. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. Just to add a data point, Charlie Barron's did do a targeted campaign to UW campuses, all UW campuses, but especially specific shout outs to Oshkosh, Superior, and so on, which got, just to get out to vote, it was nonpartisan, which got about 250,000 views in the state across all social platforms. So I do think that that begins to reinforce the idea that both individuals and a comedic and more social approach might begin to move this needle. Well, I want to actually open it up for questions, and I think we're going to use cards again. So if our folks who are distributing cards could distribute cards, maybe we'll talk for just another minute while those are being distributed. I guess one of my questions is this, we'll end on here, that oh, we have a question, even better, okay. So, what are your thoughts on the Barnes-Johnson race? I've seen Dems on coasts blame Barnes' platform for being, quote, too extreme for Wisconsin voters. Is this the result of GOP disinformation, or is there some truth to this?
I was on a panel last night at Ripon College, and we spent a lot of time talking about this race. People had a lot of questions. I think, there are a few things that contributed to the way that turned out the way it did. I think Mandela Barnes did not benefit from having a relatively uncompetitive primary. He really didn't have to fight through that primary. He didn't have to respond to any attacks. No one wanted to go negative. And as a result, when he came through, I think that Democrats clearing the field for him was probably a pretty big mistake, and I will be interested in hearing, what the party and what candidates think down the road as they've had some time to reflect on that. But the result is he came through undefined and untested, and everyone's got an opinion on Ron Johnson at this point. Ron Johnson has defined himself, and whether you like him or not, you know about him and you know what his deal is. Mandela Barnes came through, even though he had name recognition, he was lieutenant governor, he came through relatively unknown, and there was no response at the ready for these attacks that Democrats knew were coming. They knew defund the police was going to come up. They knew abolish ICE was going to come up. They knew the links to what the so-called far left were going to come up. And there wasn't really an adequate response to most of it. I think also you obviously can't discount the factor of race. We all saw the ads mostly coming from outside groups, dark money groups, where candidates and people don't have to be held accountable necessarily for those messages that are coming through because they're not coming from a direct candidate. So that certainly didn't help, and it helped define him as the sort of an unknown at that point. But if you look at the way that opinion shifted on him and the way that independent voters shifted on him, it's a classic campaign problem where you don't get to define yourself. He didn't have the chance to define himself, and so Republicans got to do it for him.
I'll just add, I wrote a piece about the race. I think that one of the key things that was maybe underappreciated, to tag on to what Jesse was saying, was there was a period of about 3 weeks in September where the DSCC, the National Dems, went dark. Essentially in Wisconsin, he was being outspent 7-1 with these, essentially racist ads, Willie Horton-style ads that were really damaging to his campaign and to defining him. And then when he did, finally, it did eventually reach a kind of parody, but it was kind of too little too late. I also thought the messaging moved around a lot from sort of a inclusive economic populism to then shifting to abortion to different issues that without necessarily staying on a thing. And although I think Johnson is quite well known, I do think that it's underappreciated, and Dan and I were talking about this last night, how extreme he is in terms of also the January 6th, his support for that, and he was going to hand Mike Pence a slate of fake electors from Wisconsin and Michigan, and I'm not sure there was a good enough job showing him as a threat to democracy, which clearly benefited Evers, and he has more of a role in protecting it than Johnson. But still, that extremism where you saw like Carrie Lake narrowly defeated and other people with similar views were defeated, and Johnson wasn't. And Johnson is a really interesting figure in that he has never strayed from an Ayn Rand libertarian economic view, but he's also been able to marry that with this Trumpian populism, which occasionally embraces some economic apostasies, like being against NAFTA. Johnson is a strong supporter of outsourcing jobs, and Mandela's campaign was focusing on that, but then kind of shifted away from it. So I think there was just not a super clear things. But I think with these close elections, like they're almost overdetermined. There could be, there's 6 things that could have made up a difference of 1 point, and all of them probably conspired to make that.
I'm going to, oh, go ahead.
Just to add one more thing, I think it is also really important to acknowledge just how close that race was. You know, it was 1%, it was 27,000 votes. I think the expectation going into election night that Johnson was going to win. He's going to win by, you know, somewhere between 3 and 7% maybe, which is in Wisconsin landslide territory. But you know, it just, like, for all the criticism that there has been of Barnes' strategy and whether he, you know, was able to go the distance to define Johnson as not just a Republican senator who you might disagree with on abortion and taxes, but a uniquely problematic Republican senator, they came so close. Like, it was the closest Senate race in Wisconsin in more than 100 years. So I think it is really important to acknowledge just how close they got to defeating a 2-term incumbent with an outside group that was spending tens of millions of dollars, that there was no Democratic equivalent. Mandela Barnes is a 35-year-old candidate running in a statewide race like this for the first time. And it was 27,000 votes. So I think there's plenty to pick over, plenty of good reasons to pick over the potential, you know, flaws with the Barnes campaign and whatever. But they did kind of outperform expectations at the end of the day, I think.
Do you want to say anything? No, I'm going to jump in with the follow-up question, which speaks directly to this. Toya, did you want it? Oh, sorry. There were 46,000 fewer votes in Milwaukee County in 2022 compared to 2018. I can't check these numbers, but I'm going to assume that they're correct. Why? And what are the implications going forward?
I guess I'll answer the Milwaukee question as a proud resident of the city of Milwaukee. You know, I think it's first important to acknowledge that it wasn't just the city of Milwaukee that turnout was down. It was Milwaukee County in general where the turnout was down. And that's compared to 2018, which 2018 had presidential levels of turnout in Milwaukee County. I think people in that election, not only kind of emboldened by the blue wave resistance after Trump, but also I think Milwaukee County voters had about had it, Scott Walker, at that point, so that was a real motivator for people to get to the polls. And I think you also have to consider the impact of voter suppression. You know, we talked so much over the past couple of years about things like banning drop boxes and other various tactics that Republican legislators had seeked out and implemented in various ways. And so it seems sometimes a little strange to sit there for years and saying, oh, they're trying to suppress turnout in Milwaukee. And then we get to the election and it's like, why was turnout down in Milwaukee? It's like, well, that was kind of the goal. So I think that's part of it too.
Toya?
I think to add to that, it was if it were to confuse, it succeeded. Because we've had a soundbite from one we didn't use weeks ago that talked about, like, she said something to the effect of, like, well, you throw up all these hurdles anyway, even if I take myself down and vote in person, how can I even trust that it's going to get that it's going to get counted? And I was like, that's disgusting. Like, that's all I could think was, like, that is so unfortunate that is where we are.
Can't say it better than that. We're gonna have, I'm triaging questions, and there's a lot of great questions here. Here's one that actually shifting focus a bit. As someone with a few years of experience engaged in a rural Wisconsin community, there's a big demand for local news voices. How do we begin to shift resources from highly produced Super Bowl style coverage of state and national level elections and politics towards the daily coverage of local topics that people are more interested in and value more than flashy broad coverage or expensive political ads?
I'm not sure. I always am reluctant to answer these how do we do these things questions, because I do see myself as an observer, but I do think one of the things about rural Wisconsin, which I've spent a lot of time reporting on, is the effect of monopolization in these communities, and you see that in the media, in agriculture, in retail, in every single aspect of life. And that has really hurt local coverage. So I think maybe a solution is having more people like my colleague Dan here out in, in Dunn County and places like that. But I really don't know the answer beyond the United States in general needs to think about, and it was mentioned in the morning sessions, the effect of antitrust and not pursuing antitrust policy for the last, since 1981. And that has had a tremendous shaping of every aspect of American life that's really underappreciated, I think. And you see it really strongly in media, these mega mergers, the consolidation of so many, and the gutting of even big city newspapers like the Journal Sentinel. Gannett now owns how many papers, Dan, in the state? 11 in the state, and they go in. Their model is basically private equity driven, where they'll reduce as much as they possibly can the editorial staff, and so you get worse coverage. And I think again, maybe the only solution is a more active citizenry trying to compensate for it. Like what Dan is doing in Milwaukee. So.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is someone has to pay for it. Whether that's finding a philanthropist who's willing to put their money up, or whether that's getting grants, going a nonprofit model, finding a way to get subscribers to pay for what you're doing. My first job out of college before I came to Madison was at the Oshkosh Northwestern, which is a daily paper which is owned by Gannett. And when I was there, we covered local government, we covered the school board, we covered the county board, we covered the city council, we covered what was going on in the community, and that changed dramatically even in the less than 2 years that I was there, because of, it wasn't a local decision, it was a corporate decision. That being said, they needed to be owned by the by that company, because otherwise they wouldn't have made it. I've seen other startups attempt I'm just using Oshkosh as an example. I've seen former journalists, community members try to start publications there, kind of in the dearth of what the Northwestern once was, and it's hard. It's hard to do that on your own. It's hard to find the financial support for it. So at some point, it's really a question of who's going to pay for it.
I think we're on to probably what's our last question, maybe two more. This is intriguing. And this speaks to the news dearth in rural areas. Would Ron Kind have won the Wisconsin 3rd if he'd ran for re-election this year? And for those of you who don't know, Ron Kind was a 26-year, I believe, anyway, longstanding Democratic congressman from the western part of the state, which is predominantly rural farming area, but also has La Crosse and Eau Claire in it. Yeah.
I mean, if you look at how close that race ended up being, this is another race where, much like the Senate race, people were expecting, Ron Johnson to come out far ahead. People had all but, decided that Derek Van Orden was going to have that locked up in a landslide, and he didn't. So I think there's a lot of questions now about what, the DCCC did or did not screw up by kind of deprioritizing that and taking their money out. So would that have been different with a Ron Kind, where it's someone that they're familiar with and has the record? Yeah, it very well might have been.
Yeah, I think we just saw in this election 2 incumbents at the top of the ticket from different parties win, right? I think incumbency is a really important factor. So in a race that was decided by 4%, would that have been a factor in that race in the 3rd district? I think it would have been. I don't know if it would have been decisive. I do think the money discrepancy between those, I think Van Orden outspent Brad Pfaff 4-1. Yeah. I think that's a factor as well. And you have to think if National Democrats would have, invested in that race as well, could that have flipped enough voters to give Mandela Barnes a victory? So it's a really, really tough one for Democrats in the Western Wisconsin district.
Well, we're getting close to time, and there's some other excellent questions here, and I apologize to those folks who've asked them that I can't get to. Does anybody have any closing thoughts on the state of Wisconsin politics? Yeah, Toya.
One of the analogies that I commonly use when discussing with whether it be family, friends, you know, someone will approach me on the street, why did you talk about this but not this? And explaining, you know,
At the
we only
store.
have, huh?
At the store.
Yeah, at the store. I'm like, I'm just trying to get my stuff at Target, please. One of the things that I always discuss with people when they say, well, I read in X, Y, and Z. Well, my challenge always to people is this, is that I say, you know, of course we would love for you to watch Channel 12 all the time, but if you feel like you're getting your information in a vacuum, just one source, you need to expand your horizons. You need to widen your eyes, look to different mediums to get a bigger picture. And I explain to people, I'm like, well, when you buy something like on Amazon, this beautiful leopard print sweater, chances are she probably perhaps looked at 3 different sweaters of that kind. You might have read a few reviews to see if it held up. Well, you know what? If you're going to spend that much time buying something off of Amazon and knowing that you're getting what you want out of it, why wouldn't you do that with news? Why wouldn't you take that and then run with it from that perspective? Look at their reviews, you know, or your other viewers or other consumers' reviews of how they, and just, I don't know, explore more, I guess is the point. Spend as much time as you would reading up about an Amazon purchase as you would consuming your news.
I just have a couple closing thoughts, just in reference to the panel this morning and just the general talk about polarization. I just wanted to add, I think it's important to remember, like, sometimes the word polarization and the idea of it gets decontextualized from what I try to focus on is the economic substructure of what's happening. And sometimes it's hard to report, like a 40-year process of deindustrialization. But I think that without that context, it becomes kind of meaningless. Like what I've seen from Trump voters that I've spoken to and from left-leaning Bernie Sanders voters that I spoke to in different places in the Rust Belt, also reported from Youngstown and River Rouge and outside Detroit, is like this intense, built-up, pent-up frustration. And in rural Wisconsin, too, the hollowing out of these communities that's been going on for 40, 50 years. And that is the context in which you have an intense, quote, polarization, and the anger gets channeled sometimes in funny ways that don't always seem rational, but sometimes after talking to people for a while, and this is in the spirit of Bill Krause, you can kind of glean what it is underneath that's bothering them, even when they drift into election conspiracies or so on and so forth. And I think it's important for us as journalists, it's one of the privileges of being a journalist, is the ability to just talk to ordinary people. That is the main function of our job, in my opinion, is to be a voice for the citizen, you know, and Wisconsin is one of the most fascinating places to be able to do that. And I just think it's important to understand what it means and where this polarization is coming from.
Yeah, I think Wisconsin is in so many ways the center of the political universe in America right now. And, you know, I think one thing that media in general could do a better job of is be a little bit more proactive instead of reactive to what's happening in the news, where I think there is so much, there's just this news avalanche that's happening all the time in Wisconsin. Jesse knows this well as a daily news reporter. But I think one of the things that I think we could all do is maybe try to, you know, kind of, in speaking to what Dan just said here, is just really get to those human level issues and figure out where people are on this instead of constantly reacting to the latest, you know, crazy tweet storm from a politician or what, you know, what the political elites in the state might have to say about a certain issue. I think it's, you know, kind of reorienting the media's focus and that as well, to be proactive about, like, hey, this is an issue that should be part of this campaign, instead of just like, here's what the campaign sent us in a press release and we're going to write about that. So I think that is perhaps a way to get towards that, civic renewal that we're talking about at this conference here.
I'm, telling this to the wrong group of people because you're all here on a Friday afternoon. But when I said it earlier, you have to pay for the news. You have to support it. I wasn't being flip. I mean, if you care about that, if you believe that journalism is important to democracy, and you believe that it's important to have an informed citizenry, then you have to support it any way you can. And that financially is the best way. That's great, but times are tough. Like, that could also mean coming to events like this. That could mean, showing up for events, like the Cap Times does them, Dan does them. We have community events where you could come and participate and tell us, what you want from us. Talk to reporters, email us, call us. Most of the time, we don't hate it. So just, try to be involved and actively support as much as you can, because state government is just incredibly important. Every form of local government is important, and we do get distracted by the shiny thing at the national level all the time, but this is where it really matters and really affects your life. And if you can find news sources that you believe are doing a good job with that, please do what you can to support them.
Thank you all. That was a great panel. Thank you very much.